I'm Phil Sterling. I've been working at butterfly conservation now for it'll be coming up for 4 years actually. But what I want to talk to you about is my project, which is called Building Sites for Butterflies, and how that's come into being, because it's based on most of my work that I did while I was working as the ecologist at Dorset County Council, and where I was there for 25 years nearly. And for the last 4 of those years, I was put in charge of all of green space management across the county council's land holdings. And that also included the road verges. And if ever there's a hot topic of debate about how and whether and when we should be cutting those road verges and encouraging wildflowers, road verges have become it, really, haven't they, in terms of our amenity green spaces. Now, when I was put in charge of those road verges, this is like putting an ecologist in charge of machinery and contracts and budgets and staff. And for the very first time, I was able to put in place the practices that you would expect an ecologist to put in charge or put in place to manage road verges and amenity green spaces, parks and open spaces, rather than relying on kind of historical practices. And so my project, Building Sites for Butterflies, is very much about encouraging developers, businesses, anybody who owns and manages green space, local authorities, to take another look, to think hard about the current practices and the design that they have for their green spaces, and to change those for the benefits of wildlife. And it's obvious why, and I'll come to explain, but just this first slide kind of captures in my mind what we're doing to our amenity green spaces, is that we simply sow them with ryegrass, we cut them, and we cut them fewer times perhaps than we used to, so they end up covered in this brown, rotting clod of grass, and there's almost nothing of any wildlife value in most of our amenity green spaces that are managed like this. And that seems to me to be kind of a sad reflection of modern life. And I think it is also something which doesn't have to be that way. We can absolutely change the direction of every single piece of amenity grassland if we wish to. And of course, there will be football pitches and cricket pitches and the rest of it where we don't want to change it. But there's an awful lot of grass like this stuff in this picture, which is doing nothing. It's just been mown forever and a day. Nobody really cares about it, but it should be supporting wildlife. And there are very good reasons for doing so. So obviously, in terms of which would we prefer, this or indeed this? And here is a piece of green space that myself and my teams transformed just outside a housing estate in Weymouth. Just the same gang mown piece of grassland that had been there gang mown for a very, very long time, with some minor tweaks to the way it's managed, moving away from the standard cut and drop mowing to a cut and collect, and including a few wildflower seeds in it, can transform amenity grasslands very quickly, just in a matter of 18 months, from something that's dull into something that's actually attractive, visually attractive, not just for insects, but for us as well. And this is the story that I want to tell this evening of how I go about my business in persuading local government, including West Sussex County Council, to change their approach to management, and to bigger businesses who are into construction, how they can design and manage their green spaces for wildlife. So that's the bit. And if in terms of the new strategy that we have at Butterfly Conservation, I suppose I would say that not single-handedly, because there are plenty on it, but I probably got to knock out in the next few years a fair chunk of the 100,000 wild spaces. So so I'm going to be working quite hard to try and achieve that over the next few years. Anyway, let's move on. Our green spaces, fortunately, we want a lot out of them these days. They're not just there to be mown. So here are some of the things that we want our green spaces to do. We want them to be able to store floodwater. We want them for wildlife. We want them as sources for pollinating bees, etc. We also are really keen to have a sense of place. Some of our green spaces, we don't want every green space to look the same. We want to know something about the character of where we are and where we're sitting and where we're placed and where we're going for a walk. And also our green spaces are terribly important for our health and well-being. Getting outside in green space is good for us, as we all know. Right. But from our point of view in butterfly conservation and my project's point of view, my focus is very much on our wider countryside species. Wonderful to hear from Emma and Rebecca on Kent's magnificent moths and some of the rare species. But what we don't want to find is that half of our common species are so far in decline that they end up on the rare species list. And so part of my encouragement of other people and other businesses is to make that difference, particularly for the widespread species. But in doing so, inevitably, you're going to be out there creating habitat which will be of benefit to some of our more local and indeed our rarer species. So my focus is on the widespread, but actually some of the consequences of the work that I do end up benefiting those that are much rarer. So I don't need to talk to you about those species in the slides. They kind of speak for themselves, don't they, in terms of what's happening. Right, but my whole message is very much about soils and plants. So actually, for much of this talk, I'm not going to be talking quite so much about the butterflies, but about our grasslands, because that's where my main focus is. And I don't have to come here into Sussex to tell you about the value of grasslands for wildlife. And indeed, what makes those grasslands in Sussex on the Downlands so valuable is they're extremely poor in nitrogen. These are low fertility habitats. And that is what is driving the biodiversity in those habitats. So all of the species that are of high conservation value are there because they're able to tolerate this low nitrogen environment. They tolerate the stress created by not a lot to grow on. And indeed, in doing so, you end up with this much higher biodiversity present because each one of these species doesn't grow very big. It grabs what nutrients it can. And there's always a bit more space next door for other species to thrive as well. So we have this wonderful potential in our amenity grasslands for if we increase the amount of environmental stress that there is in our amenity grasslands, they should follow suit and end up mimicking what's happening in our highly stressed downland situations where we've got low nitrogen. So most of the work that I do with businesses, with local government, is talking to them about creating grasslands using low nitrogen soils, effectively subsoil or bare rock. In Sussex, that would be mostly chalk, not entirely, but it could also be sands and clays. But it's using as low nutrient soils as possible to create grasslands. And it's also what are the mechanisms that we can put in place for our existing amenity grasslands to reduce and not increase nitrogen. So that's the thrust of the work that I undertake within building sites for butterflies. I don't do so much work on woodlands, basically because there's an awful lot of work to do on grasslands, and it's keeping me very busy. So here, and as I said, I was in charge of road verges for road verge maintenance for 4 years. And the one thing that is really obvious when you get put in charge of road verges is just how much cutting needs to be done to keep the road verges safe for pedestrians, cyclists, and car and lorry users on the road to make sure they can see in and out of junctions. That's why we cut the verges mainly. It's for safety. So here are 2 pictures of road verges, 100 meters apart, taken towards the end of April. And on the left, this is where my colleagues who are in the engineering team had done the standard specification, which is to put on top of the mud, they put 150 ml of topsoil and sown it with an amenity grass mix. On the right, it's the same road verge, but they'd run out of topsoil, so they just finished it off, dressed it with whatever they had, and sowed some amenity grass and left it. And you can instantly see just how important soil fertility is as a powerful driver of grass growth, because on the left, that verge definitely needs mowing. We're up to 18 inches of grass by mid-April. And on the right, no management's required at all. And yet you've got the same effect. The verge looks neat and tidy, it's perfectly functioning okay, but it doesn't need any management. And that is a really important benefit of being able to reduce fertility, is you end up with a lot less grass to mow. But look also, again, at the left picture, 2 dandelions, 1 daisy, and on the right, loads of daisies, there's quite a few dandelions, and there's a whole load of other wildflowers in there. So as the fertility of the ground reduces, the number of plants that can survive in there increases. And none of those thug species of grants, the tall grasses, the cocksfoots, the false oak grasses, perhaps the Yorkshire fogs, they're not able to dominate in those conditions because there's so little nutrient. They're still present there, but they don't dominate. So you end up increasing biodiversity, increasing your plant species richness automatically as the soil fertility decreases. And that will happen on your lawn, it will happen on any amenity grassland, just as it's happened on our herb-rich and beautiful downlands in Sussex and Hampshire and Dorset and Kent. So the easiest way to demonstrate this in practice is to go out there and take a brand new scheme and go and put that into effect. Create the very low fertility that we're after to encourage wildflowers and to get them to thrive. And I had the opportunity to do that as part of the construction of the Weymouth Relief Road back in 2009 to 2011. Weymouth was the hosting the sailing events for the London Olympics, and this new road was built into Weymouth, straight through the Dorset area of outstanding natural beauty, highly sensitive environment, indeed highly controversial scheme. But the one thing I was sure as their ecologist was, if we were going to build this road, then we would make those verges spectacular and full of wildflowers. But we would not do that with the standard specification of 150 ml of topsoil and some amenity grass. We were going to have hardly any topsoil at all, or none, and sow that directly with wildflower seeds, which you can see the mix on the right, and then let nature take its course. Really, really important to include in that seed mix. So if anybody's out there wanting to do this, important to include pioneer plants in there, because they're the ones that get going really quickly on bare ground. Obviously, for anybody interested in butterflies, that has to include kidney vetch. And it also includes oxeye daisy and common bird's foot trefoil. Those are my 3 go-to pioneer species, which will establish on bare ground with or without any topsoil. They will just get going. So 18 months, 2 years after we'd sowed this lot of road verge, that was the effect on the Weymouth Relief Road. So stunning, stunning wall-to-wall kidney vetch, which comes up on this bare ground. It's absolutely staggering. And of course, why are we doing that? Well, from a butterfly point of view, we want to encourage small blue. And small blue arrived within 18 months, 2 years of me first sowing the seed back in really 2010. They'd certainly arrived on the site by 2012, the first few, and in numbers they were seen in 2013, and the numbers of small blue have just gone on ever since. So small blue is obviously a nationally declining species. I don't suppose it's massively in decline in Sussex. It's not really massively in decline in Dorset, but nationally it really is. As soon as you move a little bit further north, I've just been helping out saving the one population of small blue left in Bristol City, for instance. So as soon as you move out of the chalky environment, it's a much rarer species. But in Dorset, It's simply abundant now anywhere around Weymouth as a result of, as you can see, a lot of kidney vetch on road verges. Not only kidney vetch, but I also had great success sowing horseshoe vetch. And I know others who've tried sowing horseshoe vetch find it's not as successful. Well, not in my experience, and I don't really know why, but it's been spectacular and heady when you go out there in the spring with the aroma, with the perfume coming off the horseshoe vetch. And Adonis Blue moved in by 2013, and the populations wax and wane on those verges now, but they're doing extremely well. Most pleasing when 2018 was the arrival of Chalk Hill Blue, which probably came in from the far distance in Portland, about 11 miles away. But sadly, since end of 2019, we haven't seen it since. Now, whether it's just in decline at the moment or just not visible, we don't know. But it's a faltering colonist at the moment on the horseshoe vetch on the road. But Adonis Blue doing very well. Here's a picture of the road verges. That one that I showed you of the kidney vetch. Here's another shot of it just in 2020. Absolutely brimming with pyramidal orchid, in tens of thousands of them. And this year as well, which has been an amazing year for pyramidal orchid all over the country, there were hundreds of thousands this year. And it's been fantastic to see such an array of wildflowers. And of course, these pyramidal orchids, they tend to be pollinated by moths, and it's regular to see narrow-bordered five-spot burnet nectaring and pollinating these pyramidal orchids. The last botanical survey we did was in 2019, and of the 30 or so species of wildflower seed that we sown, we've now got 141 species of plant that have spread in there. And in terms of butterflies, we've got about half the British list have been recorded by the gallant volunteers who've been out there doing transects on the relief road. And I think that should give us great heart that in about 10 years, we can seriously restore, put back into our environment some very healthy populations of wildflowers and of butterflies, and indeed of many other insects to go with it. And just come back to that middle slide again. That verge there has had no management since the last person to step on that verge was me, sowing the wildflower seed back in 2010. That's it. Nobody's been there with a mower because there's no need. There is no fertility, or almost none, in the soil, and so nothing needs to be mown. It can just allow the wildflowers and the wildlife to get on with doing whatever it wants to do. So it's an extremely cheap way of creating green space. Amenity green space is to get rid of the topsoil, put some wildflower seed on, and let it go. And there's my mantra: if you'll build it, they'll come. If you get that specification right of amenity grassland with low fertility, the butterflies will just move in. So monitoring started in 2012. We've now gone through pretty calamitous year, I have to say, in 2021. So I haven't added the data in because it doesn't look great. It's really not. We didn't record that many butterflies up on the relief road in 2021, but until then, it was looking pretty good in terms of the overall numbers in the blue line, and indeed the species. And most years we're recording somewhere in the region of 20 something species of butterfly on there, and overall we've got up to about 30. So these are road verges. We can do this absolutely anywhere. And part of my role is obviously to go out there and persuade people that they can design wildlife into new infrastructure. And I've been working hard with National Highways. They used to be called Highways England until about a month ago, but they're now called National Highways. And a year ago, on the back of having seen the Weymouth Relief Road and my having talked to the chief engineer for England and to his colleagues and his landscape architects, Highways England have said that from now on, or at least from last November, they will not be putting topsoil onto any of their embankments unless there's an absolute need to do so. And the benefit for them is clearly in terms of biodiversity gain, but it is also in terms of reduced maintenance, so the cost of maintenance and indeed the safety associated with managing the highway. If the plants don't grow as tall, they don't need to be cut as often. And if that is a benefit to wildlife, which it clearly is, then we'll have all of that. So there's a win-win here that Highways England, National Highways, absolutely want to get on top of. And their first scheme, using this major project instruction on low nutrient grasslands, is the A2 at Bean and Ebbsfleet. That's a junction improvement scheme leading into the new Ebbsfleet Garden Town. And that's based on chalk and chalk subsoil, and this will be constructed this winter. And the specification for about 7 hectares of the green infrastructure associated with the road junctions and leading up to the new development will be for low fertility grasslands to look pretty much like the Weymouth Relief Road. And well done them. If we're going to have new highways, and I know they're always controversial, then let's make them work for wildlife. And National Highways, I work very, very closely with them on a number of schemes. They are all over this and want to do the very best for wildlife wherever they can. The next scheme will be probably this side of West Sussex, which will be the M3 Junction 9. That's the junction next to Winchester, taking the A34 just inside the South Downs National Park. And they're looking at an enormous area of chalk grassland, which will be created for wildlife, and indeed one particular moth, for the striped lickness moth. So that's construction, but there are thousands and thousands, probably millions of hectares of green grass which just gets maintained like this picture every year. It's sort of sad, isn't it, really, is that all we seem to do with our amenity grasslands is just mow them to death. And here's an example of a mulching mower, which is even worse. And what happens when you cut that grass and leave the grass there is the grass rots down and returns the nutrients to the soil. So it doesn't reduce the fertility of that grassland. In fact, it very slightly increases it because there's nitrogen in the rain and there's nitrogen coming from vehicles. And so very, very slowly, all of this amenity grassland in our towns is getting more fertile, which creates more grass, which means fewer wildflowers and more pressure for more cutting. That is the wrong system for how we should be maintaining our amenity grasslands. It will not work, it will only cost us more money, and it will never ever deliver any more wildlife like that. So what we need to do is to change, and we need to change our mowing regime from a cut and drop mower where all of the cuttings get left where they are to cut and collect. And these machines exist all over the country, and they're used regularly on golf courses and all over the place, and farmers use much bigger versions of those as forage harvesters. But we should be using those on our amenity grassland. And that was the change that I put in place in the Green Space Management Services at Dorset County Council. And I'm very pleased to say that every urban road verge in Dorset is now on a cut and collect regime. And just as you can see in this picture, you let the grass get long and then you take it away in the cut and collect machine. So the grass, by growing in the spring, is drawing nutrients up from below, and then you are taking those nutrients away, and then they cannot return to the soil. So the grass that's left there is less fertile than it was before. So it doesn't grow as tall the next time, and there are more spaces for wildflowers to germinate and get going. And because the grass doesn't grow as tall, it doesn't need cutting as often. And because it doesn't need cutting as often, the wildflowers can increase and flower more between the cutting that does have to happen. And there's a whole raft of benefits that come from it. And one of them is we used to send out teams of 3 people to do the mowing. Person on the mower, somebody strimming around the street furniture and as a banksman, and then that hideous exercise that I don't know, local authorities seem to love, blowing leaves, blowing grass all over the place, because you used to have to blow the cut grass from the pavement and from the roadway back onto the verge, where of course all that grass rots down and returns the nutrients to the soil. if you cut and collect, you don't need that third person in the operations team at all. You can go down to a 2-person team. So there's another saving to be made. What about the benefits? Well, look, here is what was a really dull verge in Weymouth. This verge was sown with amenity grass on clay, on just ordinary Oxford clay. Nothing very exciting about it at all. 4 years into the cut and collect, this is what it looked like in actually I think it's 2019. Full of common wildflowers, but the really important point here is that none of those wildflowers is flowering so tall that it needs to be cut. So they can go through the whole of their flowering and setting seed season without ever having to be touched. That roadway is completely safe for all users to use, and it's providing this ecological benefit. And this was it this year, just to show that obviously the species mix tends to change, but full of oxeye daisies this year. And what are they? Barely a foot high. So nobody's in any danger, and the wildflowers can get on and do their thing. It's wonderful. And the great thing about moving into a cut and collect regime is you get in charge of that ecosystem. No longer are you leaving clods of grass all over the place. So if you do a cut in, I don't know, in mid-May, you might then be able to avoid cutting it then until mid-July, maybe even the end of July. And you end up with this beautiful, beautiful lawn that's full of wildflowers. And in this case here, lots and lots of birds, common birds trefoil, and indeed common blue and brown argus flying around in there. This is outside social housing in Weymouth on a cut and collect regime, where common species of butterfly are now flying around in summer on a lawn that used to be just gang mown 10, 12 times a year. The change is relatively minor, but look at the increase in the biodiversity and look at how wonderful it is to be able to look out onto a relatively neatly mown lawn, but it's going to be full of wildflowers and indeed butterflies and bees coming in there. That's the sort of change that absolutely must be made to our amenity grasslands across the country. How do we do it? Well, I say get in there and do it fast and furious. So the fun thing you must not do is try to be a farmer. So do not just take an annual cut off your grass. If you want to get that fertility down, go there and take 3 cuts off it in 1 year, in April, in July and September. Really thrash that system hard, get rid of as much fertility as quick as possible. And in this slide here, here's another ordinary boring verge on clay, sown with amenity grass. 3 cut and collects 1 year, and this is the picture in mid-May the following year. Full of common wildflowers, and absolutely no need to start cutting at all, at least until June here, because there's not enough grass to warrant it. And so the wildflowers there, dandelions and daisies, can just get on and do their thing. Go back to that road verge these days, and you'll find pyramidal orchid in there. So as you're managing the system, you're creating that diversity in the grassland, and it will only increase. There's always a problem with disposal of arisings. What do we do with the stuff? Well, that is an issue, and each authority will have to resolve with their issue. In Dorset, we would love to be able to put it into, I don't know, biodigesters or into composting or whatever, but in reality, that is not happening at the minute. And so we make sure that the grass gets left on the road verges where it doesn't matter. So underneath trees, in new planting schemes, in bramble patches, where it can rot down safely and convert any nutrients into above ground carbon, into trees and shrubs, where it's much, much more useful than it would be out on the grassland. Now, I've been advocating, and you'll have got the message already, about cut and collect. There is at the moment lots of notices that appear all over the country. Just stop mowing. Can the local authority just stop mowing? Well, what happens if you do stop mowing? Well, on the left is one example, and this is in Burgess Park in London. That's what happens if you stop mowing on fertile ground. If you haven't got rid of that fertility, you end up with 3 foot high, all sorts. Yes, some nice wildflowers, but present that to a team that's then got to manage that at the end of the year, and they can't do it. Their kit isn't powerful enough to get through all of that material, and so it can't be done. So just asking local authorities to stop mowing is not good enough. It has to be cut and collect because you have to reduce the fertility of the ground to enable standard machinery on cut and collect to get through it. And the other thing is planting mixes of annuals. We kind of think of this as a substitute for being able to kind of promote wildlife, and it definitely is not. And it looks lovely, and I think we all feel a whole lot better if we walk through fields of flowers of Californian poppy and cosmos and things like that. It does look wonderful, but it's not doing a great deal for butterflies and moths. And indeed, this is the slide that I really like these days, is that if you think of the species that are best for butterflies and moths and think of the species that are not any good, then the one that I find is common bird's foot trefoil is undoubtedly one of the best herbs that we need to encourage all over the country. 45 species of butterfly and moth are to some extent dependent upon that plant as their food plant. Compare that with common poppy. There are no species of butterfly and moth associated with common poppy. And that, while that's a stark example, it's reflected and replicated across a whole range of our native perennial plants versus our annuals, which are not necessarily native and not necessarily, they may well have been introduced with crops from the Mediterranean, which is how poppy got here. It's not a native species in this country. And if you look down there, by and large, our perennials provide for butterflies and moths nectar, pollen, food plants, and shelter, whereas our annuals provide, well, mainly pollen for bees, but also some species will provide some nectar. And by and large, our perennials are providing the resources required for generalist and specialist species, whereas annuals generally are only favouring the generalists. So I'm afraid I'm a staunch supporter of native perennial wildflowers as being the go-to wildflowers that we need to encourage on our verges and in our amenity spaces. I'm not saying there isn't space for annuals being included in the mixes, but the direction of travel has to be for native perennials. It's really important in all of this to let people know what's happening. And here's the campaign that's currently going in Dorset, #LoveYourVerge. This is about informing local communities why things are changing, really important. Just in terms of budgets, I'll have already said to you that if the grass grows less, you have less to cut. But when I started in the service, when I took over that service in 2014, I had a budget of just under £1 million to manage highway verges. When I left to come to butterfly conservation in 2017-18, I'd managed to reduce that budget, the need for cutting grass, down to £680,000 a year. And this past year, that budget is £501,000. And it won't be long before the highway verge management budget in Dorset will be half what it was when I took it on. And that is entirely working with the grain of nature, working with grasslands as an ecosystem and understanding what makes the grass grow and how do we reduce that in the first place, because there cannot be another local authority service that's able to deliver a saving year on year to the budget. Now, just before I finish, just wanted to, because of COP26, obviously, but actually we do need to think beyond the wildflowers that we want to include in our grasslands, because clearly carbon is going to be a very important part of what we're up to. We all need to move towards a net zero world, whether that's by 2040 or 50 or 60. The earlier the better, but the reality is we are going to have to move to a zero carbon budget kind of existence at some time very soon. And I think our go-to, certainly our government's go-to, is that we've just got to go out there and plant trees. That's all that seems to matter, is that we plant trees. And that misses a fundamental and very important part of the way that our ecosystem works, is that actually, in terms of where carbon is stored, is that there is a whole lot more of carbon stored in soil than there is in above ground vegetation. So our soil carbon store is really, really important. And if we think about what we know thus far, is that in this country, 30% of our carbon is stored in high value conservation habitats and covering only 20% of the area. So actually, our conservation habitats are really important as carbon stores. An emerging area is how important are our species-rich grasslands for carbon storage. And actually, we don't have as much information as we would like on this, but the direction of travel is very clear, is that the more diverse our grasslands, the greater the capacity of those grasslands to store carbon. And that is a really important part of it. How they do it, I don't think we understand, but it's probably going to be something to do with rooting structures and the mycorrhiza. So that's the living material in the soil. And rooting structures in particular, if you think of clovers, and have you ever tried to dig up a bird's foot trefoil plant? The roots go on forever down into the ground. And they're a whole lot deeper than grassland roots. And it's almost certain that that's what's happening, is that the carbon is being taken down into the ground by our clovers in particular, but also a number of our wildflowers, which have got much deeper rooting systems than grasses. And just in terms of the urgency of wanting to do something about climate change, grassland, if you create a grassland, it will start being carbon positive in terms of the storage capacity in the soil after just 2 years. And if you leave it, it will keep storing carbon in there maybe for up to 100 years before it reaches some leveling off. Compare that with a woodland, and that woodlands don't become carbon positive for at least 10 to 30 years. And if you plant woodland into permanent grassland, and you will see a lot of that around where people have gone in there very, very well meaning, planted trees into grasslands, the trees mobilize the carbon in the soil. And it will take another 30 years at least before that woodland itself becomes carbon positive. So it's a really important part of the next few years of my work, is being able to bang the drum about just how important our diverse grasslands are for storing carbon, and that it all works in one way. We simply have to increase the diversity of all of our grasslands, in amenity grasslands as well as in rural agricultural way. We've got to increase the species richness of those grasslands, because that will be very carbon positive as well as good for wildlife. Right, so that's basically what I do in my Building Sites for Butterflies program. I go around and spend my time persuading people, based on the sound ecological theory of why all this works, and also the practice that I learnt and put into practice while I was at Dorset County Council, that saying we simply have to lower the fertility of the soils that we are dealing with in our built environment, because when we do, we get all these other benefits. We definitely have more wildflowers, and that's good for butterflies and moths. They still perform their intended function, so road verges are still safe and can still be green and looking nice, and that things can be tidy without compromising wildlife value. They only get untidy if you stop mowing on fertile ground. Once you get on top of fertility, they can be neat and tidy and full of wildflowers. And they are demonstrably cheaper to look after. And now we're understanding even more that increase in diversity will allow them to store a whole lot more carbon and be better for our planet overall. Right, thank you very much.